Hello everyone, welcome to video number 10, the last and final video of this series. I'm really hoping to post this video. Today is Saturday, but it might be Sunday when I release this video because I would love to show you this quilt after it's been washed and dried and before it's boxed up to go to my client. So you will have followed in the very beginning of the process from step one to the finished completed quilt and be able to see the final results. And so I think that maybe this video will post tomorrow when the quilt is dry and I can show you everything as it's finished. I have had so much fun with this type of video series, opening up a dialogue where we can communicate, and I've so enjoyed reading all of your feedback and your comments. I've loved hearing about your first quilt, and some of you, this might be your 10th quilt that you're making and you're learning along the way. I love hearing about your quilting journey. And you know, I don't think we ever stop learning along the way. I think we're constantly improving. Even those who have quilted for 30 years, there's always something new to learn. And so yes, I've just really enjoyed this kind of dialogue. So today we're going to be removing the quilt from the frame. We're going to be making some binding, and I'm going to bind this quilt with you. Then we'll meet back probably tomorrow as the quilt is nice and washed and dried and before it's boxed up. So if you want to get to right where I start with the nitty-gritty and working with this quilt, I'm going to put a little timestamp right here in this corner, and you can fast forward to this time and start watching the action part of this video. And in the meantime, for a second, I want to just have a quick talk with you because this is something that's been on my heart for quite some time, making these videos. And I really feel like, especially the quilters out there who are just starting, or maybe you've only been quilting a year or two, and you might be down on yourself a little bit. You know what? I don't want you, as your friend, to take any part of the quilt making process, any technique that has to be involved with making your quilt. Please do not let it suck the fun and the passion out of your creative process. So if that means that you do something, a technique in your quilt that is not according to the book or breaks some quilting rules, I want you to know that that's okay. If you like using a certain batting and knowing no one in your quilting circle likes that batting, but you love it, please use that batting. It's okay. It's your quilt. And in the end, it really only matters that you love your quilt, or the person you're gifting the quilt to loves their quilt, or maybe you're making a quilt on commission like I do. I care what my client thinks about their quilt. Anybody else who comes along and says, oh, your points don't meet in your stars, or why did you not hand sew your binding to the back of your quilt? Why did you do it by machine? It's my quilt and I love it, and really that's all that matters. And so I really feel like some of you need to know that you have permission to break the rules, as long as it makes you happy and the end result is something that you are pleased with. There's always room for improvement. I'm improving every day. Each time we make a quilt block, we improve. Each time we finish a quilt, we improve. Each time we learn a new technique, a new, maybe you've never made a flying geese unit. Your first one might be horrible. Your second one's going to be better. Your 5th, your 10th, your 20th one will be better than your first. Enjoy the process and love what you do, and do not let any of the technical parts or very experienced sewers come in and make you feel like your quilt is not worthy. Because I guarantee you, everyone's going to love your quilt. And I just really felt like I had to say that because it's been on my mind for some time, and especially doing these videos, I really feel like I open myself up by sharing my life, sharing my quilts, and sometimes I get a lot of feedback that is a little harsh. And I know that I'm growing a thicker skin as I create these videos and share my stuff with you, and I just want you to know some of the things I'm going to show you in today's video is not the correct way to do it. I'm going to do it anyway. It works for me, and what works for me might not work for you. You might have a totally different way to do it. It might be the correct way. It might be a way that you've invented that works good for you. What is wrong with that? I love it when a creative mind figures out a way to accomplish a task that might be outside the box or outside the rules, and yet accomplishes a finished result that is just as superior as if they went by the rules and by the book. I hope this makes sense to you. I might just be rambling, but sometimes I feel like I have to give myself permission to do things the way that I do them. And I know I'm not the only one out there. So if you're wondering, is it okay if I do it this way? Is it okay if I use this batting and not this batting? Is it okay if my points don't meet? Is it okay if I machine sew my binding instead of hand sewing? It's okay. Now I will say, just to wrap this up before we get started with the good stuff, if you're making a quilt for a competition, then the advice that I just gave you pretty much goes out the window, because that's a whole other ball game. Competition quilts, entering your quilts into shows, galleries, all that stuff, judged competitions, then I say absolutely, if you are allowing your work to be judged by experienced panels of experienced quilters and sewers, then by all means, if you want relative good feedback on your quilt, then yes, I would stick to all the rules. Make sure all of your points show. Make sure all of your seams are lined up. Hand sew the binding on the back with very close hidden stitches, because all of those things are judged, and you are willingly submitting your quilt for that sole purpose of being judged. And so yes, details have to be spot on, and there are very particular rules that have to be met in order to win judge places in quilt shows. I've only entered 2 quilts into a quilt show, and they weren't even very fancy quilt shows. They were like county fair quilt shows, and the judges were the people who came in and looked at the quilts, not an experienced panel of judges. And even then I got some really good feedback on my quilts, and some of it was uplifting and some of it wasn't so uplifting, but I put myself into that position. So certain things, certain expectations of a judged quilt had to be met. Today I'm not talking about those quilt show quilts and quilt show expectations and rules about your quilt. Today I'm talking about your everyday quilts, quilts that you are making for yourself, your friends, your family, your co-workers, even quilts that you make on commission that you absolutely trust your techniques and your skills, and you achieve a fabulous result. I'm talking about those rules and those guidelines that you make for yourself. I think I've rambled on long enough. I'm going to go ahead and move you over. We're going to start cutting away this quilt on the frame. Keep in mind, I might do something today that's not exactly the way you would do it. And I think we're all different. And I think that that's okay. I feel like it's okay. If you do something that is different than the way I do it, I'm going to be curious. I might actually start doing it the way you do it. So if you want to jump down to the comment section below and tell me maybe something that you do that's not according to the rules, or the quilt police, everyone loves to talk about that, jump down to the comment section. I would love to know how you break the quilting rules. Okay, let's get started. Here we are at the quilting frame. I'm hoping that you can hear me okay. I do have the air conditioner on in the background so that I can stand to be in this space without completely melting. So we are at the quilt. It's still on the frame from yesterday. It's all quilted and it's ready to come off the frame. Now let me just say, per the disclaimer that we just got done talking about, most of the time when I quilt a quilt on the long arm frame, I do not remove it from the frame in the way that I'm going to show you today. However, every once in a while I get a quilt that behaves like this one and stays completely straight and completely square. And that makes my life way easier. And so, of course, I could take it off the normal way, the way by the book, and show you how to square this up. However, and I don't think that this just applies to people who have long arms, even if you quilt your quilt on a domestic sit-down machine, sometimes you're going to have a quilt that stays completely square. And to avoid the long process of squaring up your quilt, you could also trim away the batting and the backing on your quilt the same exact way. So it's not just pertaining to those who have long arms. I'm going to give you permission to trim away this extra stuff without squaring up your quilt. So let me just show you. On a long arm, you load, and I'm right down here, you load your material, your backing first, onto this bottom roller, and I just have these clips that hold it right into place. Usually, if the quilt has shifted in any way, or the quilt was not completely square from the very beginning, most of the time I will raise this bar and just pull off these little clips and release the whole quilt right off the frame, and unroll the quilt from the top roll, pull off the clips on that roll, and release everything right down to the ground. It will have the batting still attached and the backing still attached. 50% of the time I do it that way. However, this quilt has behaved so wonderfully. It's completely straight, it's completely square. So I'm going to show you what I do when I have a quilt that is like this. Alright, prepare yourself. I'm just going to take some scissors. And I'm going to come from the right side of the quilt. This is the raw edge of the backing. And I'm going to cut it. I'm going to cut it right on over. I'm sorry, I'm doing this at a weird angle so I don't hit the camera. I'm just using scissors, and it's perfectly straight because I want to keep it straight and I want to keep it square. Being very careful, I'm just going to cut right along this raw edge, right all the way to the other side. So while you're right here, I'm going to show you. Just like that. Look how straight that is. I was amazed at how straight this quilt stayed. The back is perfectly all nice and straight. And when this quilt is removed, I'm just attaching the binding. So, if you have a quilt, even if it's not on a long arm, like I mentioned, you quilted your quilt on your sit-down machine, and it behaved as beautifully as this, and you don't want to go through the trouble of using rulers and going all the way around your edges, squaring up your quilt, why not do this and save yourself some time? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move the camera over, and I'll probably speed this part of the video up so that we're not here for too long of a time, but you can see the whole process of how I'm cutting away all this extra and squaring up our quilt. Now we're going to fast forward through removing the rest of this quilt. The whole amount of time that it took me to cut away all of the extra batting and backing took about 11 minutes. So we're going to speed this part of the process up about 3 times faster so that we can see the whole process, but hopefully shorten this video up a little bit. You can see I have a good chunk of fabric left over from the bottom of the quilt. I will fold that up and save it for later. And as I start unrolling the quilt off of the top roll, you will see that I have a good amount of fabric left over on the right side of the quilt and the left side of the quilt. Carefully, I'm just going to go straight up right next to the raw edge of the quilt, being very careful with my scissors so that I don't cut into my quilt. We've done a lot of work up until this point. We do not want to have any parts of the quilt that we have to go in and fix because we're doing it this way. But it is saving me a lot of time removing the batting and the backing off by just cutting it with the scissors. As it comes off the top roller, I'm trimming away as I go. You can see how long this quilt is. It's going to start draping on the floor. I'm trying really hard not to step on it. However, if I do, it's going in the wash, so it's okay. Carefully cutting all the way up to the top. And there is the top of our quilt. I'm being extra careful where I cut away from the corners. I want to make sure that I keep a good 90-degree angle on my corners. Just because I'm cutting and removing all of this extra material from the sides doesn't mean that I cannot achieve a very square corner. You just have to be patient and pay attention to what you're doing. Yay, look at all of that extra fabric. Those little side bits from the sides of the quilt make great backings for your small projects like mug rugs. And now I'm coming right along the top edge, making sure I stay nice and straight. And we're going to remove the quilt from the frame. Now I can just remove the extra bits of fabric on that top roller and straighten up just a little bit. Now let's go make some binding for this quilt. As we get ready to make some binding, I have 1 yard of fabric here. I'm going to give it a light press, and I've already sprayed a little bit of starch onto the fabric just to give it a little bit of body. And I'm going to press this yard of fabric with a little bit of steam. For this quilt, I will need 11 strips of binding, and I'm going to cut my binding strips at 2.5 inches. I like to take the folded edge of my fabric and line it up straight to one of the lines on my mat. And now we're just going to cut 11 strips. Just a side note, I'm still using the same blade that I put in that I ordered from Amazon. And it's cutting my fabric beautifully. I'm really happy with these blades so far. There's my 11 strips. I have a little bit left over. I'm going to line my binding strips up and cut away the raw edge of the fabric and give my binding strips a nice, clean, crisp, raw edge. Next thing we'll do is meet at the sewing machine, where we are going to connect our binding strips into one long strip of fabric. I finally get to sit down at the sewing machine first time today. I have all of my prepared binding strips right here, stacked right on top of one another. I'm ready to start sewing my binding strips together to create one long binding strip. So what I've done is I've set my needle at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've also reduced the stitch length to a 1.4, and I've lowered the tension a little bit so that the stitches lay nice and flat on my thread. I'm ready to start sewing together my binding strips, and so the first thing I'm going to do is take this very top piece of fabric. This is going to be one end, and I'm going to put that off to the side. Now here comes one of those things where when I say break the rules, I tend to break the rules on how I attach my binding. Again, we can all do it differently and still be friends at the end of the day, but let me show you how I attach my binding strips. I take the very next piece of fabric and the one below that. So our very top one is off to the side. We're going with layer 2 and layer 3. I'm going to match those two raw edges up, which is kind of hard to do with the camera sitting right there. I'm sort of working at a funny angle here. I'm going to match them up and sew them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from one edge to the other. Just like that. Now let me show you the traditional way that I've seen and learned how to attach your binding strips. You would take your two pieces and you would turn one of them and you would sew at a 90-degree angle just like this, cutting away this extra, whoa, you're all the way at the end of the camera view. So a 90-degree angle from this point to this point and cut away this portion of the extra fabric. And I will say that does reduce the amount of seam that you are sewing into your binding, and your binding where the seams are will not be as thick. So if you have an issue with your sewing machine going through thicker seams, then by all means I highly recommend attaching your binding strips at a 90-degree angle and cutting apart or cutting away the extra triangle of fabric. If you're like me and that's just too much work, I can certainly do that. I can do that, and my binding is lovely. But my brain needs simple and quick, and so for me, this is the most simple way to attach my binding strips, and my binding turns out beautiful, and so I don't have any like downsides to doing my binding like this, and so that's what I do. Just like that. So I just keep grabbing the next two fabrics, making sure they're lined up straight. Now I will say you should probably make sure they're all nice and straight with one another. Put them in there and sew them just like this. So I certainly can do it both ways. I just prefer doing mine this way. just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring you along as I sew these together, but I'll probably speed up this portion of the video. As you approach the bottom, you'll notice that you have one extra fabric at the very end. Here's my next two pieces to sew together. This is the tail end of your binding. Let's go ahead and move that out of the way. And there we go. We have sewn all of our binding strips together. They're chained pieced together, so now we can just separate all of that and start pressing our seams. So I'm going to meet you at the pressing board. Now that all of my binding strips have been sewn together, we've chain pieced them together. I'm going to go through and cut the little connecting threads in between each one of the pieces, just like this. And now with a nice hot iron on a cotton setting, I'm going to press my seams open from the back side. I do a little finger press and then press that seam open with a little bit of steam. I'm going to go through and do that for each one of my seams. I think there should be 10 of them. I'm curious to know if you love doing the binding process of your quilt, or if it's one of your least favorite things to do. For me, the only reason I really enjoy doing a binding is because I know that I'm getting ready to be finished with this quilt, and I'm always excited when a client is able to come and pick up their quilt. And so I start getting excited right at this point. But the actual process of binding a quilt is not my favorite part of making a quilt. Now we're at the very end, and so we're going to start folding this over directly in half and pressing our binding. I like to press it down and then turn on the steam and really flatten that binding out. And I'm going to do this from one end of the binding all the way to the other end. So you can imagine how long this is going to take with 11 strips of binding. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this part up, and we're ready to bind this quilt. Now you can see this big pile of binding that I have, and I'm at the very end of the binding strip. So let me show you how I achieve a nice finished edge on my binding. I'll flip over about an inch of binding into the center of the binding, just like this. I'm going to press that nice and flat. I'll use a little bit of steam and then refold that binding in half. And then I'll bring in the iron again and repress that binding nice and flat. And this gives you a nice finished end on your binding. And I'm going to show you how when you put this on your quilt, it forms a little pocket that when you are binding your quilt and you come all the way to the end of your quilt, you can tuck your unfinished piece of binding right into this pocket and achieve a nice finished end to your binding. Just like that. This is my favorite way to finish up a binding. We are ready to go ahead and attach the binding to our quilt. So the first things that you want to do is go ahead and set up your seam allowance. Your seam allowance for your quilt is going to be based on how wide you cut your binding strips and how thick your quilt is. This is a t-shirt quilt, so the top of the quilt is rather thick. However, I used a thinner batting and just a cotton on the back, and so my quilt is not extremely thick, so I'm going to keep that in mind when I set my seam allowance. Now we are sewing our binding on this quilt to the back first. So I want the seam on the back side of my quilt to be a little bit wider than the seam we're going to sew on the front, and that way our stitch from the front will be hidden in the binding, and this will all make sense as we work towards that part of doing the binding. So I have all of my binding here, and let me find the very beginning part. Nope, that's the end. The very beginning in a big mountain of binding. Let's see, where is it? Looks like a big ball of cotton candy here. And it's really like that because I've shifted it around a couple times, moving all of my stuff around. Hold on one second. Okay, I finally found it. Here we are. Okay, here is my little tag. If you are interested in learning how to embroider on ribbon to make your own custom tags, I'm going to put a link in the description box below to a video I did a couple months back on how I make my own custom tags for my quilts. So in between making the binding and threading my machine, I quickly made a custom tag that matches her quilt back, and we are ready to get started. Now, I like to place my little custom labels on the right side of the quilt towards the bottom. Not exactly right at the bottom, but maybe 3/4 of the way up. So I have that pinned in place so I didn't lose my marking of where I wanted to place my ribbon, and I'm ready to start attaching my binding to the back of this quilt. I know we are up very close, but I wanted you to be able to see what I was doing. I think the color of the thread is going to blend in. It's going to be very hard to see exactly what I'm doing, but I'm hoping that you get the idea of how I'm doing this. And if you have any questions, I would love to try to help. If you want to jump down to the comment section. I do understand it's going to be hard to see, but I didn't want to put black thread in my client's quilt at this point, so just bear with me on that. Here is the very top of my binding where we just got finished folding that over to a nice clean finished edge. I'm gonna move forward about 6 inches into the binding, and that's where we're going to get started. So I'm going to have a little tail of binding that we are not touching until we get back to the beginning. I'm going to place this. I don't want to start sewing right at the label, so we're going to move up here just a little bit. Match up the raw edge of my binding to the raw edge of my quilt. And we're going to go ahead and lower the needle. Now again, your setting on how far over you need to come is going to be based on your quilt and your binding. So what I like to do before I get too far in is I'm going to go ahead and sew into this just a little bit. I'll even sew in this label because I want to make sure that that's nice and secure. I have all of this bulk of quilts sitting on the table next to me. I'm knocking things off my table. Let's remove that pin. Let's match the raw edge of the label to the raw edge of the quilt and bring the binding down. I'm going to hold all of that in place and just slowly go right over top of that, making sure not to shift anything around. We want to keep that label nice and straight. I'm going to sew down just a little bit further and then we're going to stop. Now at this point I usually stop what I'm doing, and I usually do this while everything is still attached. My needle is in the down position and I can check right up here how my binding is going to fold over to the front and how much room I have for the front part of the binding. Because you probably cannot see that, I'm going to go ahead and unattach this from the machine, and we're going to take a look at the seam, which is very hard to see. That's how much space I have there. And we're going to test this out and flip that binding over to the front of our quilt. This is the line that we have just attached, and I know it's very hard to see with this lighting. We want to make sure that that binding goes over top of that line and covers that line just like that. When we sew the binding on the front of the quilt, we will come in about right there and sew that down, and it will catch right inside the back of this binding. I hope that's clear. Again, if you have any questions, jump down. But at this point, that's a great time to test it. And if you are too far over, or you're going to have a huge flappy part on your binding on the front, now is the time. You only have a little bit to pick out and start over. So it looks like that we're good with this setting. I'm going to go ahead and finish attaching the binding. And this is going to be a bit awkward because this is a large quilt and we're in a small space here, and I'm trying not to hit the camera. Let's go back in there, start this again. I have a thread that's caught up there. Of course I do. And now we can just finish attaching this binding. Again, all of the weight of the quilt is just sitting on a table right next to me, right on my left. And so as I move along, I'm just adjusting the bulk of the quilt and making sure that the part that I'm getting ready to attach the binding to is laying nice and flat. And on a quilt this size, there's lots of stopping and adjusting. Just like this. I think we'll work down to the first corner, and we'll do that first corner together. Adjusting all of the quilts. Here is the first seam in our binding where we piece the binding together. If you pieced it traditionally or at a 90-degree angle, your seam would actually be coming through like this. So now, to better explain it, we're going to be sewing straight across here And when we bend this over to the front, you're going to have a little bit of thickness in this seam. Some machines don't mind sewing over that thickness, and some machines do. And so it really all depends on what you like and how your machine handles that. I'll tell you, with the weight of this quilt, you can't go very far without making some adjustments, because the tension wants to sort of drag the quilt to the left. Have you ever noticed that some quilts are just more attention seeking than others? I think this quilt, because she's all pink and pretty, she is requiring a little bit more attention than the rest of my quilts. Or at least the quilts that I've done lately. I'd say this one by far is the biggest I've done in quite a while. Again, a walking foot might help you achieve an easier stitch. You'll notice I don't have my walking foot on. I never have my walking foot on. I will say I'm a bit of a creature of habit. And so once I've developed a technique or a way of doing something, I have a really hard time making a change. Sometimes that might work against me. Alright, we're getting closer to this corner, so just be patient with me. Alright, we're getting close to this bottom corner. I'm going to come in and sew all the way down and stop about 1/4 of an inch away from the bottom edge of this quilt. I'll take some double stitches or some back stitches to lock those stitches in place, and then I'm going to remove this from the machine. And my finger is going to be in the way. Alright, there's my back stitches. Let's take this out of the machine, and now we can do our mitered corner. Let me see if I can move you down so that you can see this a little bit better. We're going to take our binding. We're going to form an L shape with our binding. We're going to bring the long part that we haven't used yet, and we're going to fold that at a 90-degree angle, just like this, so that the raw edge of our binding is matched up to the raw edge of our quilt. The binding now has the shape of an L. Holding everything nice and flat, I sort of do a finger press with this fold right here, and I'm going to hold everything in place with my fingers, and I'm going to bring the binding back onto the quilt. And so now we have a reversed L shape. And I'm matching up the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the quilt. And I know the lighting is horrible right here, I'm so sorry. You should have this little flap that looks just like this. That's where we're starting. We're going to bring our needle in right there. I'm going to hold all of this in place just like that. You could throw some pins in there if you wanted to. Now we're going to shift all of the weight of this quilt right around. I'm holding that right in place. I'm going to slide it right in underneath my needle and lower that needle right down in there. I'm going to take a few stitches forward, and then I'm going to reverse all the way to the edge of the quilt. Really lock that into place, and now we can start sewing again. There is our little mitered corner. Oh goodness, you are off the camera. Some days are so much easier than others on recording. Here's our little mitered corner. I hope you saw that. And now we can continue sewing the binding straight down this side until we get to the next corner. I'm going to go a little bit further and then bring up that corner so you can get a good look at it. Okay. Will it reach? Oh, it'll reach. There we go. So this is what your corners will look like. It'll have a little triangle flap just like this. That will fold over to the front of your quilt and give you a mitered corner on both sides. Okay, this is going to take quite a bit of time to attach the binding to the back of this quilt. When I get all the way to where we started, all the way back around, I'll bring you back and I'll show how I tuck in the raw edge of the binding into the very beginning of the binding. Well, that certainly took a good long minute, but I've worked my way all the way back over. Here's the very beginning. Remember, this part is still loose. I just have it pinned in place so I know about where to stop and trim off the extra parts of this binding. So I'm going to work a little bit more down towards the beginning of this binding. And let's stop right there. Okay, where's my scissors? Whew, it's hot in here. Okay, right here is going to be the opening of this binding. Let's go ahead and trim off all of the extra binding, which is only about 10 inches, so that's not bad. So now we have a little binding tail that we're going to flip right into this opening of the binding. Remember how I showed you right after we were done making the binding? It's just going to tuck right inside that opening. Let's make sure everything lines up nice and flat and pretty. Just like that. There's my opening. It's got a nice finished edge to it. And we're going to just slowly make sure the presser foot doesn't catch that. Go right over top of that opening and sew it closed. We're going to go all the way down to where we started stitching, which is right here. And now we're going to go ahead and go into it just a little bit beyond where we started, and we can do some back stitching and lock all of those stitches in place and remove it from the machine. So there is our binding attached to the back side of our quilt. There's our little label, so that's how that's going to look. And now we're going to flip this binding over to the front side of the quilt. Now I have the quilt right side up, pretty side facing up, and we have our binding attached to the back. Many of you have seen an earlier video I did quite some time ago. It was in one of my t-shirt quilt series. I showed you how you could attach your binding using the Elmer's glue, one of my all-time favorite binding methods, and it's almost foolproof and gives you excellent results. It is a little bit time consuming, and so I have noticed that since I've started attaching my binding to the back and flipping it to the front, I eliminate the whole step of going through and glue basting my binding, so that saves a little bit of time. So we're going to go ahead, pardon me, my allergies are so bad right now. We're going to get this quilt situated. It is so hot in here. And we're going to pull this binding right to the right side of the quilt. We're going to sort of just finger press that and get it ready to work. We're going to, with a little bit of tension, pull that binding right over top of that stitch that we just made to attach our binding. I'm going to hold that in place. You could use some pins if you wanted to. And I'm going to bring it to the machine just like this. Now, my needle is still in the position where I attached the binding. If I lowered my needle and started to sew, more than likely I would be in the seam of where I attached my binding. You could certainly do it like that, but if you move to the left or to the right, just a smidgen, your stitches might look a little bit messy. So at this point, what I like to do is go ahead and move my needle over a few notches on my machine, just like that. I moved over, I think, 3 or 4 notches to the right. I'm going to lower that needle and keep my place. This is going to give me a small little flap on the left side of the seam, but it's not going to be huge, and of course you can adjust that. And I would check all of this before you start sewing everything all the way closed. So let's go ahead and sew a few stitches. I'm going to lower my stitch length just a bit and take a couple back stitches just to lock that in place. And now I can start finishing up the binding on this quilt. So as we go, I am pulling the binding from the back of the quilt. I'm going to give that a finger press, get it prepared to work, and then I'm going to just lightly pull that up over, just over the seam, and come down and sew just like this. Work that seam, bring the binding over, and sew that seam. Now I'm not pulling it so taut that it's going to misshape the binding. We just want it to cover the seam on where we attached it. Of course, you could pin all this in place. You could go through and pin the whole thing down and then bring it to the sewing machine. But you can see as I'm working the binding, we're also sewing, eliminating some of those steps. Let me go a little bit further and then I can bring you over and show you the seam on the back. At any time it wants to start misbehaving, you can lift up that presser foot, flatten out the binding, and keep going. I think sometimes I have to remind my quilts that I'm the boss. Alright, here's the opening where we tucked our flap in. This part is going to be thicker, and so if you do not like that, I think there's maybe 10 other ways that you could finish this off, and this is just how I do most of my quilts. It just takes a little bit of extra care. You could also, instead of using your fingers, you could use an awl to bring your binding over and hold it in place as you're sewing. If that's something, if you're used to using tools like that, an awl would be a great way to hold this binding in place versus having your fingers up close to the needle. We'll go a little bit further, and then I think I have enough room to bring the binding that we've sewn up close so that I can show you. Yeah. Alright, and hopefully the light is good enough so that you can see. No, it's not. Goodness, there we go. This is the back side of the quilt. This is where we attached our label, and that is the seam where we have sewn the binding on the front of the quilt. It just falls to the right side of where we attached our binding and looks nice and neat. So of course, those are all things that as you're working you'll want to just double check as you go along, but definitely when you first get started, do some checking before you attach your entire binding. I'm going to finish binding up this quilt, and then we're going to meet back at the very end. We'll take a quick look at this quilt with the binding on before it goes into the washing machine. I was sewing along and it dawned on me that I should probably show you how I approach sewing the corners when I've attached the binding to the back of the quilt. I have some loose strings hanging everywhere. So I'm approaching the corner, and I'm still flipping the binding from the back of the quilt to the front. We're going to work that corner and push out that point. We want a nice pointy little corner, so that's what it looks like from the back. We're going to just poke that little corner right out with our fingertip. And we're going to lay the quilt nice and flat on the bed of the machine. I'm going to bring this binding up just like we've been doing all along. And this time I'm going to sew all the way into this corner, but stopping before I get to the edge. I really want to hold this piece of binding in place as we rotate the quilt. So I'm going to come down to close to the edge and take a few stitches to back up, and we're going to stop at that point. Here we are close to the edge, not directly to the edge, but close to it. I'm going to back up so that I can work with the next piece of binding, which is right here. At this point, this binding is held down by the stitches, and we can work with this corner and pull that corner right up into place and manipulate it until you get a nice little pointy corner there. I'm going to hold that in place with my finger as I work with the quilt for just a second. So my fingers might be in the way for just a second. Just want to make sure that that's going to lay nice and flat. So just like that, I'm holding this new flapped over piece in place with my fingers. I'm going to sew back down until my needle just catches this new piece of binding we flapped over. One more stitch. There we go. Now that's going to hold it in place as I lift up my presser foot and rotate the quilt around. Just like that, we're turning. I'm going to make sure that this binding is all nice and straight. Now I can lower the presser foot again and continue sewing. See how nice and pointy that corner is? I thought I better show that part before I ended the video for today. I have a bunch of strings. Again, just working the binding to the front. And now I can finish up my quilt. There's our little corner, nice and pointy. Here we are. This quilt is all finished. All I have left to do is to throw it through the wash, and I will throw a couple of Shout color catchers in there just because I did not pre-wash my backing. I never pre-wash my backing. I don't usually pre-wash anything, and don't hate me for that. But I'm going to show you how this turns out. I will wash this quilt in tap cold water and then put it through the dryer on a normal drying setting. And tomorrow we'll meet back as this quilt is laying on the rack. It's too large to hang up on my design wall, and it's at this point it's too heavy with all of the batting and the backing on it anyway. So I'll have it draped over the frame and we'll take a look at how everything has turned out. I'm absolutely thrilled with the results. Here's my binding from the front. That is very nice and clean looking. And my binding from the back. Maybe you can see that little line of stitching. Very professional, and to me it eliminates a step of pressing and glue basting, and you can just sit at the machine and turn on some music and enjoy doing your binding, if you enjoy doing binding. Let's see if I can find my tag. I'm probably at the wrong side of the quilt. Oh, here we are. Here is my little satin ribbon tag. It is just sewn into the back of the binding and brands my quilt and signs my quilt all at the same time. Okay, I'm going to go throw this in the wash and fix a coffee and chill out and watch some TV. I'll see you in the morning before we finish up this video. Good morning, everyone. It is Sunday. It is supposed to rain all day today. The quilt is out there in the studio and it's been drying overnight on the quilt frame. I put it through the wash yesterday and through the dryer, and of course it was so large that it was about 75% dry, so it's been drying just hung over top of the rack overnight. I'm going to give it a couple more hours and we're going to meet back when I get back from church, and then I'll brave the rain and go out there and we're going to take a look at this quilt as it is all finished. See y'all in just a little bit. This is it, everyone. The moment we've been waiting for through 10 videos. The quilt is so large, I'm not going to be able to get everything into one shot, but I'll move around the quilt so that you can see. It's draping all through there and all the way off the back. All the way down there. So let's take a few peeks at this quilt. Okay, yesterday before we washed the quilt, did you notice how plump and crisp everything looked? And after you wash a quilt, it looks very textured and very quilty and soft. See the difference? Now, if I were doing a quilt for a quilt show, I would not wash it. I would have it very pristine and crisp looking. But my favorite is a quilt after it's been washed. And that's the main reason why I wash a quilt before my client gets their quilt. Because it is so soft and drapey. Look at this drape. See that? Aw, it is so snuggly. And plus, I want my client to know that this is how their quilt is going to forever look. If I were to send my quilt freshly quilted and not washed, and then sometime down the road they washed their quilt and it came out of the dryer like this, I would never want them to think that now their quilt is messed up because it's crinkly and quilty looking. This is how their quilt will be forever. So I would never want them to think they've messed up their quilt by washing it. Does that make any sense? So there's the quilt. And plus I like to wash my quilt because, especially with a larger quilt like this, it is draped on my floor countless times. And so I just want it to be nice and clean when my client gets their quilt. And I want to see how well the quilt holds up. I mean, wow, I have lost count at how many quilts I have made actually. There have been a handful of quilts, maybe 4 in my lifetime, where one of my seams separated. Maybe only 4 quilts, but it does happen. And so I want to quality check my quilt before I ever even send it out. And so I'm going to wash it and dry it, and I'm going to look it over and make sure that there's no issues with my quilt. I'm also going to wash it because I don't pre-wash my fabrics that I use, and I want to make sure that there's no bleeding with my fabrics. Let's take a look at some of the pictures. Now some of the pictures faded just a tiny bit, but not beyond what I would call normal fading for the product, the June Taylor sheets. They still look really great. But the blacks are not quite as black as before washing. But they still look really good. We'll move over here. And look at all of the little pockets at the bottom and along the sides. Isn't that so cute? So we'll just move over here. I want to thank Meloni, the owner of this quilt, for allowing me to videotape all of her memories and her quilt being made. So that was so nice of you to allow me to do that and to share this process with everyone. Look, here's another little pocket. Isn't that cute? I love that feature on a quilt. Let's take a look at the back. There's my little satin ribbon. The binding turned out great. Let's take a look at this corner that we did together. Still nice and pointy. So this is the final result of the quilt. I have really enjoyed this series with you. If you have followed along, I just want to thank you for spending time with me. And I really wish you could get a full view of this quilt, but now that it's nice and clean, I am not going to lay it back down in the grass before I send it off to Miss Meloni. All right, this completes this series, and I really look forward to doing more types of videos much like this one. I hope you have the rest of your weekend is awesome, and we will see you really, really soon. Bye, everyone.